Okay, guys, hello, they online. Hello, Joel.
Hello.
Thank you for coming. Yeah, please introduce yourself.
My name is Joel Dietz. I'm a writer and entrepreneur. Been involved in many of the sort of very early blockchain projects looking at the future of digital currencies as it applies to kind of organizational design and governance. And currently advising a number of sort of investment banks and governments about sort of how to take things to the next level. So.
Okay, and my first question about forward-thinking strategy after the post-COVID. For the investors, yes, for the investors.
Okay. Investors in blockchain specifically, or just?
Yeah, like, yeah, blockchain and crypto space.
Well, I think
digital
right now,
assets.
Yeah, right now we're seeing, a convergence, both of kind of different yield farming and very more sophisticated DeFi assets than we had seen in the past that have a kind of governance component. So I think it's a really good way of approaching problems is to find a kind of clear model from the business side that has a very clear underlying financial value, and then build, a thin governance layer on top of it that then directly benefits the people who are participating in governance. A couple of years ago, we were seeing more free-form DAO structures, but they were very experimental in kind of how they structured their governance, and there was a lot of kind of risk associated with them. And right now, we're seeing kind of more institutional people get involved and a variety of ways to kind of de-risk things. So I think that's one of the biggest opportunity areas, both around the actual companies that are building these things and the assets themselves, is to figure out the ones that most closely leverage that benefit of taking, the innovative aspects of blockchain, but providing them so they're very clearly providing a benefit to a kind of traditional business structure and other types of traditional assets.
And what is the challenges during the COVID for the blockchain startups and for the institutional investors?
Well, a lot of things are not done through in-person meetings anymore. There's a lot less travel going on, and it's difficult to kind of get to those sort of handshake versions. A lot of people also are tied up with their existing portfolios and trying to keep them above water, since a lot of startups and things have had very difficult times. I would say for a lot of it, there's been a little bit less sort of institutional or appetite for kind of highly risky ventures, but that's not always the case. There are certainly people out there who are proving new ground and really looking for the things that are being neglected that are really high potential as well. And as we were just talking about, there certainly hasn't been a huge slowdown in, for example, the development of the DeFi space. So people are at home, they're still looking for things that are going to fit those kind of parameters. So I don't think it's massively impacted that world. But for things that affect the government, though, I mean, there's lots of governments, both municipal and national, that have just slowed down. Not to say that they were necessarily fast before, but they've gotten way, way slower during this COVID period. So it's kind of interesting, as like sometimes the people who are already used to remote work have actually accelerated their process. People who've been used to working in an office and kind of in some more traditional social hierarchy, their process has gotten a lot slower.
Interesting. Joel, and what is your advice for the startups who want to go into the pivot or who should stay alive right now?
I think it's always good to get your bases covered. I produce also video education on, crypto mastery topics that gives people an introduction to trading, to the things you should know before starting a crypto business. And I see a lot of people come out and start a business without necessarily understanding how cyclical the markets are, the kind of ideological components of the market, how to integrate with sort of regulators in the law. So those are all important things. Those courses are at 123mastery.com. So I'd say that just having your bases down is always important because, you do often have to outlast some cycles. The COVID is a really interesting example because that's like a geopolitical national, cycle that affects everyone. But just in general in the crypto markets, there's been very high highs and very low lows. So you kind of need to plan that in both your psychology and your financial planning.
Interesting. And what is the advice for the investors as well? Maybe you can recognize new business models because actually 10 years ago, it was a time for the share economy, and maybe it should be new, the new technologies as well.
Yeah, I mean, as a specific example, something I'm working on, I've seen a massive arbitrage around, some traditional real estate properties that are single family or, hotels, whatever, that can be converted into co-living things because people don't want to live in cities. They don't want to live in single bedroom apartments. They'd much rather, in this kind of COVID period, live in sort of among community that is kind of united together. So, that's like one new business model that's being teased out. I think there's probably a lot of other ones that are leveraging those. I participate actively in the Clubhouse app, which I don't know if you've seen, but that's like really pioneering audio, chat, and communication. And that is, again, it's something that was really made possible by COVID. So I think that there's a bunch of things that are in that category that people are actively exploring right now.
And what is your insights beyond the next 15 years in technology aspects? What do you think about OpenAI or the telemedical and maybe I don't know, green energy or maybe education tech and blockchain as well?
Yeah, they're all very interesting things. I think starting with the education stuff was very interesting to see how people who have onboarded early on educational platforms, that have a individual kind of modular learning approach to them can learn lots of things much faster than the traditional educational system. And I think that will become very, very apparent. As well as the actual access will become much more distributed and widespread, and you'll be able to have people kind of go and self-educate in all of the core things that people thought were necessary, including software engineering. I think broadly speaking, learning how to interact with AI and computers and give them instructions, what some people call programming, but is sometimes broader than that in some ways, is the literacy of the future. And I think we're going to see a sort of massive ability of people to get that off the ground. And I think one result of that, is some people think of entrepreneurship as building companies, and that's partially correct. But there's also a lot of low-hanging fruit for just creating little projects, that are out there on the world. And once the sort of blockchain organizations become sufficiently easy to set up, that anyone can do it with one click and $20 or something. I think that will greatly change the ability of people to create all kinds of services. So you could have some 13-year-old in Bangladesh creating the best educational module around how to create different types of memes, and then it's going to be consumed by some 65-year-old in the United States who's going to use that as their primary educational platform for learning about how these things work. So I think there will be a lot of.
And how it's could be work with gaming?
Gaming is another
like a gaming plus education.
The gaming part of education specifically. Well, I think to some degree the educational system is already gamified, but it's like got one kind of big game that people play. Like people think of like having a Harvard degree as an important thing, or some kind of like MBAs or certain schools that people associate with a kind of brand image, and then that opens up doors and kind of credentialing. I think what we'll find is probably a plethora of smaller games, that each platform that develops some kind of brand, prestige around it will be perceived in that same kind of thing. Like, oh, you got to like level 35 and, this particular category. And there's, as in our life now, there's sort of low prestige games or, games that are kind of particular to some sort of subculture. But many of them, I think, will be related to how people develop their careers, so that your career can actually be sort of gamified in a certain within certain subcategories.
Mm-hmm. And what is like a new trends in future of finance and wealth management? What is the next? Mostly it's all about new products and maybe new segments. What is it coming out of it?
I think a
Like
lot
you
of
mentioned about, sorry.
it's a similar category, but I would say that I think a lot of traditional finance people don't realize how gate kept it is, how like narrow the range of people who get involved in finances, just like psychologically, profile wise, that it draws a certain thing. And then once you really allow, for example, kids to create their own financial instruments around their favorite games or whatever else it is, there's just going to be a broad range of things that is not covered by traditional finance, and that they're not necessarily going to know how to cope with. They're going to end up having to hire 15-year-olds to help them figure out like what the different sort of game currencies are and why one is more valuable than the other.
And what is your best case in decentralized finance?
I think that there are some asset classes where decentralized finance makes more sense than mainstream finance, and is likely to be, make them much more highly profitable. So I think that trend will continue, basically for particularly new types of asset classes that have some digital payment necessity built into them, some kind of annuities or other things of that sort of structural nature. So it's a trend that's sort of already happening, but there's obviously been various regulatory and other barriers. But I think in like 10 years, you'll see certain asset classes just be predominantly sort of DeFi and some kind of ledger based.
Interesting. And how is work for the impact investment?
I think impact is a really great category of things where you add in some front loading of your data, which is in some ways is more of but I think many people who are growing up in this particular era, and particularly maybe blockchain people, or people who've done a lot of stuff with deep learning AI, they're used to data-driven decision making, and that the whole impact space will really shift, at least between the sort of sophisticated people that are coming up to people who are using the data first, and then basically measuring their assessments of whether or not there's impact based on data, as opposed to the sort of more fuzzy type of logic that people use when they're normally talking about impact.
And what is your best case in impact investment for the cryptocurrency?
I would probably best case is that there's some sort of programmatic way of doing that, because I think one thing that people have observed correctly about the cryptocurrency world and industry is that, partially because of electricity usage and other things like that, it doesn't really directly interact with public goods. We're in some ways we're used to people paying taxes, and then taxes going to theoretically at least do fund public goods. And that may be true for like roads in the country where you happen to live, it comes from tax revenue, but it's not very indirect when it comes to like global things like, the climate or, cleaning up the oceans, which never actually happens, and things of that nature. So I would really, the best case is definitely that crypto people find a way to use their own technology and ways they're doing it to create solutions to big public, goods problems, like this giant floating island of plastic in the Pacific.
Joel, and how we can improve innovation during pandemic? What do you think about remote work? Because it's like it was typical for the decentralized startups. It was like they're really helpful for the Ethereum team. How it's work right now? What do you think about remote work?
I think remote work sort of is the future, but there's variations of it, you know. So you, in general, working on a computer is what, you know, most tech professionals do, and it takes up most of their day. But there's a lot of ways that it can be made pleasant, you know, whether you have wellness and a good environment and, you know, kind of good sunlight and plants, and the whole environment that you're doing it in can be very conducive to a good overall state of mind. And that, I think, partially relates to diversity of experience. You know, for example, having like a wellness studio that's nearby where you can kind of get massages or other things of that nature. Um, COVID has kind of, in some ways, enhanced that possibility, partially because, you know, it's made people think very seriously about co-living and who the immediate group of people that they are with is. And then, you know, you can kind of configure your pod, so to speak, so that it has a broad range and kind of diversity around it. Even if most people are spending, you know, 10 hours a day in front of their computers working on various, you know, technical projects, you know, you still have to eat, you still have to, you know, move your body at various points, and making sure that that's kind of in the environment is a really important thing.
What do you think about next generation of the trading strategies?
I think, you know, there's going to be some interesting opportunities as people, you know, look for more obscure data sources, and as well as we understand the human brain and how it operates better. There's a lot of like decision making that people make. I mean, obviously there's various tiers, but at some level, pretty much always there's some human making a decision, even if it's to decide which amount of capital to allocate to some kind of AI or what have you. And we're understanding the human brain a lot better. So I think there's going to be a lot of stuff that goes into that, and even you know, sentiment analysis is obviously a big thing already, but kind of going a few levels deeper and how we understand those things, and then, you know, putting it in a kind of streamlined way into sort of algorithmic trading strategies.
And it's same like for the blockchain technologies and for the cybersecurity in blockchain.
Yeah, those are all interesting things. You know, one thing that blockchain
Friends, what do you
people.
think?
Yeah.
See, what is the next for blockchain, for the blockchain technologies and cybersecurity in beyond like the next like 5 years?
Well, one interesting thing that is not discussed as much as it probably should be is, you know, blockchain, and we talk about this again in my sort of course on crypto, but it's really a software layer more than anything else. You know, it's a connectivity protocol layer. You know, it does maintain a kind of common ledger, but it doesn't, you know, there's a lot of room to be done around both secure networking, how the actual protocol layer stuff is managed and passed. So I think people will, first of all, at some point realize that they haven't gone deep enough in the stack, so to speak, as far as the hardware that these things are being run on, to really examine them for the security of those things, and that people will start investing more heavily in those type of devices. Obviously, you have some of those already, you know, when it looks at like Ledger Nano or Treasure or the things that people are doing for hardware wallets, but they're not going as deep when it comes to kind of the protocol layer sort of security, like, for instance, the router level of how messages are passed on the internet. And I think we need to kind of, if we're really serious about kind of blockchain and distributed systems, you have to look at like the routing nature of the internet and how it exists.
Yeah, is it same for the digital payment systems?
Yeah, it's the same, and one of the reasons that they're able to exist the way they do is they really heavily rely on regulation, and, you know, that some government agency is going to go out and like catch the bad guys for them, and in blockchain, you know, you just in general you can't rely on those same type of things, and different governments have taken different policies about, you know, how to catch people who are, let's say, professional fraudsters or what have you, but they haven't always been successful.
And what do you think about next framework, regulatory framework for the blockchain technology and for the cryptocurrency in US?
What will be the next framework? So
Yeah.
I think these things, Ethereum too has a good chance of kind of being one, predominant framework, just because Ethereum pioneered a whole lot of the smart contracting things. They pioneered the idea of having a language that was specific to that and a virtual machine that was specific to it, and has been a pretty open place, relatively speaking, for people to build on top of. People still haven't really built the more, aggressive, let's say, like decentralized applications. For Bitcoin, like the Silk Road and those type of applications was such a large part of how it got going, as well as all kinds of decentralized gambling apps and things like that. And the smart contract world still hasn't really seen anything close to that degree. So I think that'll be interesting. I think we'll see some ones that move basically in a more enterprisey kind of financial direction, where they start supporting large financial applications, and then other ones that move in a sort of more like, whether you think about it or not, some people will call it utopian, some will call it kind of dystopian, but ones in which it has really the full automation and kind of pursue some of the more edgy use cases of these technologies.
And how it's work for the privacy?
I think the privacy, is always dependent and is always a little bit relative, because the nature of blockchain transactions is that they're less private in some ways than any other type of transaction. If you kind of have some ability to trace back kind of identity, but there's also your own sort of ways of obscuring your identity as you participate in them. And really, both of them are becoming more sophisticated over time. So it's kind of like you always need to stay on the kind of cutting edge of understanding both, for example, mixing technology and demasking, transaction technology to understand really what's possible on either side. And take sort of your own reasonable precautions depending on exactly what you're doing.
What do you think? Who should be the next unicorn in crypto space?
That's a good question. I think there's room right now for a kind of real estate DeFi project. I think Compound, and some of these sort of balancer type projects around yield farming are going to continue to grow. I think some other things are going to come out of the chain link, kind of that type of project.
What is your personal opinion about Telegram ICO? What's happened?
Well, I think it's really sad what happened in general, that there isn't really room for people to build those type of applications, and that the regulatory structure is so stringent, and maybe even monopolistic in an anti-competitive way that Facebook probably says, well, if we can't do it, then no one should be able to do it. No one should be able to do these things, and that's really slowing down the innovation that could be happening around these topics globally. So I think it's definitely not a good thing for the world that these technologies can't move forward.
And for the investors, same. I think it's not great for the credibility. Okay, and what is your like a trading strategy, like your personal trading strategy?
I try and do things
during COVID.
I'm sort of a fundamentals person ultimately, so I try to figure out if there is a fundamental business model improvement for any kind of yield farming project, and then as much as possible feed into things that are algorithmically based, so that the capital allocation can be done, based on kind of pre-established formulas. And then similarly, I'm a big believer in the sort of big cryptos, that are kind of proven, and just kind of maintaining that as the kind of bulk of the portfolio. Including obviously, both Bitcoin and Ethereum, and then just kind of, selectively going in. But I don't actively day trade, and I never really have, but I certainly look at trends. And I also, I'm very friendly to different kind of algorithmic trading strategies based on sentiment data and various other things.
Yeah, and maybe you give like special advices for the startups who want to go to the fundraise online, like the use traditional capital, venture capital, want to use
Yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity there for
like
right now.
yes, yeah, like what is the best strategy for the fundraising right now?
I think the best, strategy is to move iteratively, and get really good advisors and feedback early on, and take your advisors, feedback very seriously, and really working down, on the core kind of business model. It's really better if you have some kind of business model that makes sense outside of crypto, that you're providing some enhancement, to via crypto, than something that is a total new kind of experimental thing. Not to say that there haven't been successes in the total new experimental thing, but it's really nice if it has some kind of underlying kind of validation, and port something that has been done well before, and always like going through your areas of innovation, because if you're experimenting on all fronts, you're probably not going to succeed in knitting them together. So that's one of the first things, just from a sort of technical architect, when I have my hat on, that I do to any kind of project that I advise. I look at all of their areas of technological innovation, and I basically say, you should really only ever be really creating a product thing that has innovation in one particular area. So if you're like doing something novel in blockchain, you probably shouldn't be doing something novel in like, your cloud storage mechanism at the same time, or whatever else it is. Because too many bleeding edge technologies are likely to kind of cause a sort of collapse. So there's a few things. One is really making sure you have highly validated technology that has a clear, implementation pathway and is feasible. Kind of understanding the market as it currently exists, and what sort of things are topical and interesting to the market. Because in crypto markets, definitely it's hard to kind of ride against the wave. So it is a little bit like surfing in that sense. And then kind of iteratively going through kind of feedback with very credible advisors, and kind of building momentum in the right direction.
And okay, and what should be in the top focus or the attention of these startups, like the DeFi startups or blockchain startups, and your personal advice for the best mental health?
I think there's a lot of opportunities, but a lot of them are basically right now going into traditional business models that are dying, where COVID and stuff like that is actually pushing them over the edge, and then figuring out what the arbitrage is to kind of bring them new life or find a new business model. It's not necessarily specific to blockchain, but I think blockchain can really leverage these things. And, similar thing like, municipality, different kind of, city governments and stuff like that. A lot of them are basically bankrupt at this point. I think it'll be really clear in the next 6 months just how, seriously bad some of these situations are, and figuring out where you have a kind of advantage in some area to kind of resuscitate or bring some new life back to something.
And what is your best advice for the mental health?
Mental health is really coming back to, your body at least once a day, if not twice a day. I always start my morning with kind of meditation, and sort of do some, yoga, flow, fitness kind of thing pretty much every day in the afternoon. And I think just really the importance of the physical body and taking care of it, and, creating movement and kind of patterns is really one of the most critical ingredients in sort of mental health as well.
Okay, thank you, Joe, for your time. Thank you for the live stream.
Yeah, my pleasure. Yeah. And I hope that anyone who goes out and creates some sort of startup during the sort of COVID period does extremely well. And send me a message, I guess. Let me know what's up.
Yeah, thank you so much.